All right, now for some reaction to the briefing by the Basic Education Minister Angie Motshekga, we're joined by Professor Mary Metcalfe, who is an education specialist from Wits University, Education Union, or Teachers Union rather, Sadtu's Deputy General Secretary Nkosana, Dolopi, and Tshegofatso Phala from Equal Education. Thank you to all of you for joining us here on NewsLink. Let me start with you, Mr. Dolopi. In terms of the teachers that are expected to go to school, we heard the minister say that 80% of them have already been vaccinated. Is it still Sadtu's concern with regards to those overcrowded schools where, you know, sometimes you find a ratio of up to 70 pupils per teacher in some of our schools here in South Africa?
Look, Masiro, let's start this way. To say that since the start of COVID-19, I think late 2019, early 2022, when the schools were closed for the first time, I think in 27th of March 2020. And our view since then has been that the reason why schools were closed at that time was based on science, was based on advice from health practitioners and health experts. And we had a view that we will always follow that advice from the health experts, from scientists, will always advise and guide us on any decision that we should be taking on whether schools should be reopened, how they should be reopened, and how learners would then be returned to school. Up to now, we are still holding that view that as teachers, we take serious the advice from our health practitioners, from scientists, because they are the people who know best in terms of how to address these things here. To come to your question, yes, indeed, the question of overcrowding remains a serious concern for us. Not only because of COVID, like we've been saying even in previous interviews, that the question of overcrowded classes, more especially in the township schools and at the schools in the rural areas, is something that we have been experiencing long before COVID. We've been saying that COVID maybe came to amplify, to make it even louder and clearer to all those who are in power, to say that it is not educationally sound to have children put into these overcrowded classes, because you are not able to reach each and every learner, and therefore the development and progress of the learners is affected by overcrowding that many of our teachers, many of our members in the townships and in the rural schools are subjected to. We have always made the call that we need to discuss the post-provisioning model. That is a model that we are using currently in the country in terms of the employment and the deployment of teachers into different schools. We have not had sufficient deployment of teachers to our township and rural schools, and that to a large extent is affecting the whole question of quality learning and teaching.
Let me come to you, Phala, from Equal Education. I mean, what Mr. Dolopi is saying is exactly what the minister also alluded to herself, admitting that, you know, the issues of infrastructure and overcrowding at schools is something that was our reality in South Africa for a very long time. COVID-19 just put it more in our faces. But for the minister to come and say, yes, this is indeed a problem, we need to fast track. It's been a while since we've been hearing that same that same sentiment from the department. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, at the Equal Education Law Centre, we do agree. Whilst we definitely welcome the return to ordinary timetabling, we think that the main reason why learners had to rotate, which is the systemic issues which exist around infrastructure, is really something that as learners go back, we're really going to have to concentrate on. The problem of infrastructure is not one which came across or came about just because of COVID. It's a systemic issue which existed before COVID came. And we're really hoping that budgets will be allocated to try and improve infrastructure in schools. I mean, at our movement organization partner, Equal Education, you had some learners saying that, look, for the first time in my life, I was in a class of 30 learners and I was getting the attention that I needed. And so whilst we welcome the return to full-time and ordinary timetabling, we do think and welcome the points which the minister has highlighted, the areas which they want to concentrate on infrastructure, on ensuring that there's access to vaccination for learners over 12. There's a need to look at those sort of things. And so we welcome those sort of things. We welcome the discussions with Treasury, because we know when COVID-19 hit, one of the major repercussions on education was that there was a decrease on the infrastructure budgets for education. And so if we are speaking about returning back to school, if we're speaking about improving the systemic issues which exist around infrastructure, that discussion really needs to lie around budgets and availability of budgets.
And I mean that budget, 1 billion rand so far for about 1,095 schools that were only damaged from storm damage. So basically there's more schools that need infrastructure development besides that 1,095 that needs repairs because of flooding and storms. Let me go to Professor Mary Metcalfe. Thank you very much for joining us, Prof. Now, of course, I think during the course of the week, you and I knew, right, that when those regulations changed to scrapping of that social distancing, it's something that the department was asking for a long time. And so it did go, it did support their call for full-time learning. But of course, you were saying that, there are other ways of making sure that COVID-19 doesn't spread besides social distancing.
Absolutely. What I enjoyed about that press conference is that the minister was very clear. There's problems that we had before COVID, and these are serious and they need to be dealt with, and it includes the whole gamut of overcrowding, infrastructure, the consistent challenges of textbooks. But the important thing about today is that after nearly 2 years of real damage being done to young people, children, all the way through primary and secondary school, because of the necessity of being careful, of listening to the science and not being in school, we now should be celebrating this wonderful return to school. I think that we should be proud as South Africans that we've been able to achieve this, because there's many parts of the world where there's still a great deal of hesitance. Now, you're correct that social distancing, I prefer to say physical distancing, is just one dimension of the whole story. Physical distancing is important, but it's much more important to have ventilation, to be able to wear masks because it's an airborne virus. It's more important to be able to ventilate our classrooms, wear masks, hand sanitize, and know that in South Africa we now have quite high levels of immunity, both because of vaccination and because of the number of people who've had COVID even without knowing it. So it is now safe to return, and the benefits of returning are so much greater than the minimal risks. So yes, we must keep, as civil society, as unions, as academics, interrogating what's being done to address the long-term problems that must be resolved. But for now, it's safe to go back to school. The science has said so. The minister has the support of all of the stakeholders, and let's hope if we can start helping our learners get back into the rhythms of daily attendance.
And of course, Professor, I just want to stay with you. We know about the inequalities that we have in our country. So going back to school, at full capacity is quite an achievement for some pupils. I mean, I have my colleagues, for instance, Mangoba Mkhunu, who spoke to a grade 9 pupil who was saying he's ecstatic to go back to school because every time he'd go to school, it would be 2 days in a week, and then he goes back to school and he's forgotten what he learned the previous week. You know what I mean? But I just want to ask you, with regards to scientists saying that we could go into our 5th wave, is it warranted for people like parents to be concerned that, this might again disturb learning? Or is it better to go back to school full-time now so that if that does happen, at least learners have gotten some type of full-time education in the meantime?
It is true that we are constantly learning about the virus and it's constantly changing, but the evidence is clear from the scientists that they expect us to be able to proceed without further major disruptions because of the high levels of immunity that have been built within the system. we need to get learners back immediately. We need to keep watching the science. And if anything happens that requires greater caution again, we have learned so much. Schools have done so much and have adapted so well. We'll be ready to adapt to the new challenges, but it's urgent to get back to school, and I'm happy.
Let me come to you again, Mr. Dolopi. We heard from the Minister during this very press briefing that schools were given about 3 days to prepare for tomorrow. Do you think that was adequate time for teachers and support staff?
Look, she also mentioned the fact that the conditions at the schools would also dictate in terms of how many days it will take. What she was putting forward was just a proposal. But you must remember, it must be a function of communication to parents, communication to learners, to all stakeholders. And it might take, in some instances, more than the 3 days. What is just important is the establishment of the principle to say that learners must go back to school, like Prof just said now, that we need to attend to the question of them losing out since 2020 up to now. So this will then afford them an opportunity to be able to be at school on a daily basis, progress like all other learners would have progressed, especially those who are coming from the affluent schools in the suburbs, because we know that they were never really disrupted in the same way that the learners in the townships and the learners in the rural areas would have been affected, because they could quickly move to other platforms to interface, to engage with their teachers. So to a large extent, the people who were affected the most through these COVID interventions were the learners from the township schools, were the learners from the rural areas. And later maybe you would come to know that there were other consequences as a result of this lockdown or the closure of schools. We learned that between 500,000 to 700,000 learners also drop out of the system as a result of this. We also learned about high levels of pregnancy that we experienced during this time. So I'm saying maybe the attempt of reopening schools will also be to address some of those social ills that came as a result of the lockdown. So we are saying we need to attend to our children, but especially the emphasis must be around the question of those in the townships who have lost so much up to now. They should not remain behind, and we're leaving those who are from the affluent schools to proceed smoothly.
Let me come to you, Tshegofatso. I mean, what Mr. Dolopi is saying is, what Equal Education has been, fighting for is basically your mandate as an organization to make sure that we don't have to talk about the difference between schools in the suburbs and schools in the townships or rural areas and speak about how disadvantaged one area is to the next. But that's our reality. And I wanted to speak to you about a specific issue that Equal Education has even taken the department to court about. And this is the food system, giving those poor learners food who need it. I think the fact that we're going back to full capacity learning is probably going to be helpful to those learners who rely on that meal that they get at school, because I know that Equal Education was fighting for the learners to still be given food even when they're at home. So now that they're fully back at school, at least they'll have that meal a day.
During the lockdown, one of the major things we continue to speak about is equal education loss learners were losing by not being at schools. We concentrated around not just lost learning time, but access to the National School Nutrition Program, access to psychosocial services, and so much more that learners lost, because for many learners, the schooling environment for them is a place of safety. And so we are grateful that the 9 million learners who are accessing the School Nutrition Program will be back at schools, will be able to access their meals. And we will, of course, just be monitoring whether the feeding program is back to full capacity. We welcomed what the minister said about them already having let people know and let providers know. And really for us, as the Prof says, it's celebration all around, and it's celebration and happiness that after 2 years, all of our learners will now have access to school every day and will be at school every day.
Professor Metcalfe, I remember earlier this year, Panyaza Lisufi, the education MEC here in Gauteng, speaking about receiving over 102,000 new pupils for this academic year. He actually went on to say that to tell the Premier, David Makhura, that they needed to build at least 40 schools a month or every 3 months to be able to reach the capacity and give pupils that 30 pupils, 20 pupils in one class, etc. So if this is a problem in Gauteng, you know, a small province with so many people living in it, can you imagine how it is in rural areas and townships?
Well, it's actually a little bit more complicated than that, because not all provinces have the same in-migration. So there is, because of economic factors, some movement within provinces from more rural areas to more urban areas because of loss of employment, because of perception of economic activity possibilities in urban areas. So some provinces are losing families and other provinces are gaining families. Because of that, you have schools in the wrong place. You have schools in rural areas that are emptying and schools in urban areas that are becoming very full. This is something that provinces need to plan for vigilantly, and we also need to be able to make sure that we understand that it's going to have to be temporary solutions in a rapidly growing province like Gauteng. EE did a wonderful research study on overcrowding in the East Rand of Gauteng, and it is a challenge.
And I mean, I just want to go back as well to Mr. Dolopi, you know, looking at how many schools we need here in Gauteng, where obviously we have a much higher population than many provinces, but we're also in a, you know, an advantage because of how developed Gauteng is compared to many other provinces. But let me talk to you about vaccination. I was speaking to a legal expert yesterday from ENS Africa, and he was talking about how these new regulations are going to bring in a new, you know, a very interesting legal debate. And that is, of course, the rule or the policy that was put in place by government last year that said that those who feel unsafe because those who feel unsafe to go to work because of COVID-19 can tell their employers that I don't want to come to work because so-and-so is not vaccinated, etc., right? But now, when you are asymptomatic but test positive for COVID-19, you don't have to stay at home. You must go to work, right? You can go to work. So now, does that mean for teachers who are, for instance, not vaccinated, can they call their schools or district or whoever they call and say, I choose not to come to work today because this teacher and that pupil tested positive, but they're still coming to work and I feel my life is in danger? What are we going to do about that debate?
Look, I don't think in our sector, in education, we have a serious issue of people who are not vaccinated. I think when the idea of vaccination was introduced in the country last year, and teachers were amongst the first to be vaccinated, I think we have a high level of teachers who would have vaccinated, with exceptions of a very, very few. It could be less than 20% of them who are not vaccinated. So I think we should be able to manage situations of those who are not vaccinated in our sector much better than in any other sector of the economy. Our position as the union, also led by the position of our own federation, Sadtu, is that we are not supporting mandatory vaccination. We always emphasize the point of mobilizing society, encouraging them, educating them, and showing them the importance of vaccinating. So I think we, as a country, as a government, all of us as stakeholders in education, must try to focus around that idea of making sure that we convince those who have strong views against vaccination to say that no, it's in the interest of themselves, in the interest of those that they are staying with, in the interest of those that they are working with, but also in the interest of the country and our economy for them to consider the question of vaccination, but also argue in terms of health, what are the benefits of them vaccinating. So it should not be a question of pushing it on them. We should reach out to them, talk to them, correct the mind, and in so doing, I think we will be able to move without serious issues between unions and the employer. But there's something that I think you will really allow me to come in to Sifro on this thing of inequality in our country and how we think we should address it. It can't be an issue that we just talk about it, that we have inequality. It's almost like it's a poem. We're always reciting inequality in our country. We are holding a strong view as a union, Sadtu, led by Sadtu around this thing, that it can't be that in a country where you have billionaires, people who have benefited from the wealth of this country, and their wealth continues to grow on a daily basis. The Mutsipes, the Oppenheimers, and many, many other billionaires who continue to grow their wealth on a daily basis. And on the other side, we have a poor Majamini in the rural area who can access basic services and human rights. And you have those people who are so rich. So we have always made the point that they must contribute to address some of these infrastructural challenges that we're having in education. The building of schools, provision of more infrastructure, the appointment of more teachers. And through COSATU, we're making the call for a wealth tax. These people in business, all of them who are employing these people, are beneficiaries, are the main and primary beneficiaries of our education system. Because it's through our education system that they are getting these skills. There must come a time that you in eNCA and all broadcasting companies start to open a proper discussion for us to say that even if government can address questions of corruption, maladministration, and all those things, wastages, still government will not be able to address all these challenges that we're having as a society. And therefore, we must make a brave and a loud call to those who have that we can't coexist with those who don't have. They will have to just come to the party and contribute in one way or the other to address these challenges that we're having. It's for the sake of our country, for the sake of our children, and for their own sake as well.
Definitely, I get your point. I do get your point, Mr. Dolopi. I'm just interested to know what Professor Metcalfe thinks about that question that I had originally asked Mr. Dolopi, Prof, about that possible debate around whether teachers can simply say, well, I feel as though my life is in danger. I'm not vaccinated or I am vaccinated, but so-and-so who tested positive for COVID is not showing symptoms and is carrying on coming to work, so I'm not going to come to work.
Such an important question, and by the way, so is the question of inequality, and I don't mean to detract from Dolopi, but to come back to that question, there's a principle that I have to acknowledge Prof. Madir Shabi, mine's gone, Prof. Mahdi, for helping me with so clearly, and that is that the majority of cases of COVID are have no symptoms. So you have to approach the whole of your life with that understanding, whether you're at home, at church, at school, in the shops, wherever you are. There will be people who don't know they have COVID. There is no symptom that they have COVID. That's why we have to take precautions always, why we have to ventilate always, and why we can't just make one-to-one correlations. This person is sick, therefore they have a problem. We must avoid them. There's countless other people who have COVID. We have to treat ourselves as if we're infected and everybody else as if they're infected. I think Shabir Mahdi has said that as few as 10% of the cases of COVID are actually symptomatic. And he said that consistently from the beginning. So the hypothetical question of a teacher saying you asymptomatic, you wouldn't even know that they have COVID. Does that help, Ms. Eko?
That does help. That does help indeed. I mean, I've had friends who, for instance, Prof. Metcalfe, would just be going to a test because they happen to be at a cost or something, and they take a test and they have COVID and they had no idea the entire time. So I know exactly what you mean. Let me end off this reaction debate with Tshegofatso. We've been speaking about equal education, of course, for children or pupils who go to school. But it's also important for the teachers who teach these children to also be able to be given the tools to give that quality education to the children that they teach, right? And sometimes really I want to go back to that ratio that is worrying. We have a very small amount of teachers who are expected to look after so many pupils, and besides the social distancing or physical distancing part of it, I think maybe if you could just speak to us about that problem that also needs addressing, just employing teachers. I mean, the minister also spoke about having to employ more teachers because of the teachers we've lost due to COVID-19. So it's an even smaller number now than it was before COVID, came into the country.
Thanks, Motshekga. Yes, obviously the ratio of teachers and the amount of teachers we have also plays a role in this issue of overcrowding and a role in how many learners are getting a teacher. And so we do think it's something that must be concentrated on alongside getting additional infrastructure, alongside getting more classrooms. And so it definitely is something that we think needs particular attention.
All right. Thank you very much to all of you for speaking to us here on Newslink and giving us that reaction to the Minister's address. Professor Mary Metcalfe from University of the Witwatersrand, Sadtu's Deputy General Secretary Nkosana Dolopi, and Tshegofatso Phala from Equal Education.